He did not own a razor. He had never needed one. His mother had packed his haversack with cornbread, 2 pairs of socks, and a Bible she pressed into his hands at the gate of their farm in Caldwell County, North Carolina. She did not cry, at least not where he could see. He was 14 years old when he marched away with the 26th North Carolina Infantry, and he was still 14 when he walked into the worst single day of killing any regiment in the American Civil War would ever know. His name was recorded in the muster rolls the way most boys' names were recorded, without ceremony, without footnote, wedged between the names of farmers and blacksmiths and men with wives and children waiting at home. Nobody thought to ask his age twice. He was tall enough to carry a rifle. That was the only arithmetic that mattered in the spring of 1863. The march north began in June, and by all surviving accounts from soldiers his age and younger, it did not feel like what they had been told war was supposed to feel like. It felt like something else entirely. The land changed as they crossed the Potomac. Green Pennsylvania farms rolled out on either side of the columns, fat and quiet, and nothing like the worn Virginia roads they had spent 2 years bleeding across. Some of the men laughed. Some of the officers let their soldiers pull cherries off the trees along the road. One private wrote home that Pennsylvania looked like God had been considerably more attentive up north. The boy would have noticed the same things they all noticed. The barns painted red, the limestone fences, the way civilian families watched from windows with expressions that were hard to read. He had been told this was a liberation campaign, that the North would fold if Lee could win one decisive victory on their own soil. He was 14. He believed it. The Army reached the Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg on the first day of July, 1863. Though reached is not quite the right word, they stumbled into it. What began as a reconnaissance by Harry Heth's division, looking for shoes, became, within hours, the largest battle of the entire war. Nobody planned it that way. Battles in that war rarely started the way the generals intended. Lee had not wanted to fight a general engagement in Pennsylvania without Jeb Stuart's cavalry screening his movements and reporting Federal positions. Stuart was off on one of his mounted raids, conspicuously absent at the worst possible time, and Lee was in effect blind, maneuvering 75,000 men through enemy country without reliable intelligence about where the Army of the Potomac was or how fast it was moving. He found out at Gettysburg. George Meade, the Union commander, had taken the helm of the Army of the Potomac only 3 days earlier, and he found out where Lee was at almost the same moment. 2 armies that had been circling each other across the breadth of Pennsylvania collided in a crossroads town neither of them had specifically chosen. The 26th North Carolina was part of Pettigrew's brigade. They came up the Chambersburg Pike and hit the Union First Corps along McPherson's Ridge in the late morning. What happened next is documented in enough letters and regimental histories to reconstruct almost moment by moment, and what those accounts describe is something that no 14-year-old on Earth was built to survive without permanent damage. The Federal position was anchored by the Iron Brigade, the black-hatted Midwesterners who were, man for man, among the hardest fighters in the Union Army. When the 26th North Carolina crossed that open ground toward Herbst's Woods, the Iron Brigade did not run. They held, and the 2 lines tore each other apart at ranges sometimes close enough that men could read the expressions on the faces trying to kill them. The regiment went in with 800 men. By the end of the day, 588 of them were dead, wounded, or missing. In a single afternoon, the 26th North Carolina suffered the highest regimental casualties of any unit on either side in any engagement of the entire Civil War. Company F went in with 91 men and came out with 3. The boy survived July 1st. We know this because he survived to leave an account. What he described about those first hours at Gettysburg was not heroism in the way the recruitment posters had framed it. It was noise so total it stopped being sound and became something physical, a pressure you felt in your teeth. It was the man beside you disappearing mid-stride, and the way your feet kept moving forward because stopping felt worse than the alternative. It was the smell, which the veterans always said no one who hadn't smelled it could properly imagine. Black powder smoke, copper-wet air, churned earth, and underneath all of it, something else that had no name in polite language. He crossed that field in a line that had been 800 wide and came back with what was left of it. The boys who made it back to the Confederate lines were not the same boys who had crossed. Something had been removed. You can see it in the letters they wrote that evening, the ones who wrote it all. The sentences get shorter. the handwriting changes. Whatever elaborate patriotic grammar they had been using since 1861 mostly disappears, and what replaces it is plain and stripped down and true. The second day of July brought the kind of waiting that soldiers consistently described as its own form of cruelty. The Army reorganized its lines along Seminary Ridge. The dead lay where they had fallen. The fields between the two armies were contested, and nobody was going out to retrieve much of anyone. In the hours between July 1st's carnage and whatever July 2nd intended to bring, the regiment sat in the uncomfortable company of its own losses. Officers counted heads and wrote down names. Men who had shared rations and marching songs with someone the day before now spoke about them in past tense with the flat, careful tone of people who had not yet fully processed what they were saying. The boy would have been surrounded by men doing the same arithmetic he was, calculating who came back, subtracting who didn't, trying to make the numbers mean something other than what they meant. A 14-year-old sitting on a fence rail somewhere along that ridge would have spent the daylight hours of July 2nd listening to the battle unfold to the south, where Longstreet's corps was hammering the Union left at the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den and the boulder-strewn hell of Little Round Top. The sounds rolled up to him. He could not see it. He could only hear it and wait to be told what came next. Waiting, the veterans always said, was one of the things no one prepared you for. You went into a battle, and the noise and motion made the fear manageable. But sitting on a ridge the morning after and listening to someone else's battle while the flies found yesterday's dead, that kind of waiting had its own texture. It asked different things of a person. What came next was Pickett's charge, though in accurate history, it should more rightly be called Pickett's Pettigrew's charge, because George Pickett's 3 Virginia divisions did not go forward alone. Pettigrew's men went with them. The decimated 26th North Carolina, down to a fraction of its July 1st strength, was expected to step back out into the open. The order came on July 3rd, in the early afternoon, after nearly 2 hours of artillery bombardment that both sides would spend decades arguing about. The Confederate guns fired first, 170 of them, in an attempt to knock out the Union batteries on Cemetery Ridge before the infantry advanced. The Union guns fired back. The noise was reported by witnesses miles away. The ground shook. A soldier in another regiment wrote that he pressed himself flat behind a stone wall and prayed with a sincerity he had never managed in church. Then the guns stopped, and in the silence that followed, the order to advance went down the Confederate line. The charge covered nearly a mile of open ground. The Union cannon that had gone quiet during the Confederate bombardment, quiet in part to save ammunition, not because they had been silenced, opened again the moment the gray line stepped into the field. Solid shot, shell, canister. At close range, a cannon loaded with canister was not a cannon anymore. It was a large shotgun pointed at a formation of men. The boy walked into that. He wrote later, in the account that has survived in fragmented form through the recollections of his post-war community, that he stopped being afraid somewhere in the middle of that field. Not because he had become brave, because he had, as he put it, run out of room inside himself for fear. The body will do that. It makes some cold, quiet calculation about what it can afford to feel and shuts the rest down, and you keep walking because the alternative is to stand still in a field where standing still will kill you faster. The 26th North Carolina reached closer to the Union position than most accounts give them credit for. Some of Pettigrew's men got within yards of the low stone wall at Cemetery Ridge, where the Union line bent at a right angle, the place that would come to be called the high water mark of the Confederacy. A few crossed it, not many. The Union defenders, Irish and New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians fighting on ground some of them had farmed as boys, held. The retreat was, by every account, worse than the charge. Going forward, at least, there was momentum and noise and the strange tunnel of focus that combat forces on the mind. Coming back was different. Coming back was walking across the same ground that had just been crossed, past the men who had been cut down going the other direction, with nothing in front of you but a long stumble back to the Confederate line, and the knowledge, settling in slow and heavy, of what had just happened. Coming back also meant passing through the evidence of the charge in full inventory. The rifles dropped mid-stride, the cartridge boxes emptied on the ground by men who had fired everything they had before they fell, the flags of regiments that no longer existed as functional fighting units. At Gettysburg, regimental flags mattered the way they mattered nowhere else in common life. A flag meant the regiment was alive. Losing a flag in battle was the kind of wound that a unit talked about for decades. Men had been shot dead protecting pieces of colored cloth, not because they were stupid, but because the cloth stood for something that mattered more to them than their own preservation. Coming back without the flag meant something specific. Coming back with it meant something else. Either way, you were coming back across ground covered in evidence of what the last hour had cost. Lee met the survivors as they came back. He rode among them on Traveler and told them it had been his fault, not theirs. The soldiers who wrote about this moment later, and many of them did, never quite recovered from seeing Robert E. Lee say that. Some of them called it the moment they knew the war was going to end the way it ended. The boy from Caldwell County was among the men who made it back. He was 14 years old, and he had now participated in 2 of the 3 days of the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. He had crossed open ground twice under fire. He had watched his regiment destroyed in a single afternoon, and then reduced further across the following 2 days. He had seen things that we struggle to describe, even now, with the full weight of 160 years of distance and clinical language to help us. What did he do that night? The accounts don't say specifically. What the accounts from young Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg generally describe is silence. Not the dramatic silence of fiction, the meaningful pause before the speech. Just exhaustion so complete that even grief couldn't find a foothold in it. Men lay down where they stopped walking. Some ate, some didn't. Some wrote letters home that they kept short because they didn't know how to make it long without making it real. The Army withdrew from Gettysburg on July 4th, retreating south through rain that turned the roads to mud and made the wagons loaded with wounded men into a column of extended suffering that stretched 17 miles. The boy walked in that rain with whatever was left of the regiment he had marched north with 6 weeks earlier. He made it home eventually. He outlived the war, which was not guaranteed, given how many men who survived Gettysburg were killed in the grinding campaigns that followed: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg. He lived into the 20th century, long enough that the world he came back to looked almost nothing like the one he had left. The country had been through Reconstruction, through the rise of the lost cause mythology that tried to put a romantic frame around what he knew had simply been 3 days of men killing each other in Pennsylvania farm fields. He would have passed people on the street who did not know what he had been part of. He would have read the marble inscriptions going up at Gettysburg, the careful official language of monuments, and weighed it against what he knew. He knew what the cornfield at McPherson's Ridge smelled like on a hot July afternoon after the shooting stopped. He knew what his own boots felt like crossing open ground with artillery working through a formation of men walking beside him. He knew what 588 casualties inside one regiment inside one afternoon looked like on the ground when you were standing on it. He had been 14 years old. He had packed a Bible. His mother had not cried where he could see. The weight of Gettysburg was not carried by the generals who planned it, or the politicians who made the decisions that led armies there. It was carried by boys like this one, who went in barely old enough to shave and came out carrying something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for. Most of them never quite managed it. Some things are not meant to be described from the outside. You had to have been there, standing in that field, 14 years old, with the guns starting up again.